this dog had a family. Like, this dog is fat, it's comfortable, it's happy.
Enough's enough. We can't keep relying on volunteerism and philanthropy.
Forgive the student loans. Pay the people. Hello, and welcome to Critters and Cultures, the podcast where we explore the fascinating intersection of animal welfare and cultural diversity. I'm your host, Dr. Azalia Boyd, ready to uncover how cultural differences influence, enhance, and sometimes challenge the way we care for animals and relate to each other. Join us on this journey through global traditions, learning from diverse perspectives, and advocating for empathy and respect in all of our interactions. Joining us today are two incredible guests, because we only have incredible guests on this show. First, we have Dr. Emma Jackson, a trailblazing veterinarian and advocate for equity in veterinary care, particularly within Indigenous communities. As a proud Indigenous veterinarian, Dr. Jackson brings a unique and vital perspective to the conversation around access to veterinary services. Many of you, if you're looking, may recognize her from her recent APTN docuseries, Wild Rose Vets, where she showcased her daily work as a veterinarian while exploring her Indigenous heritage and cultural identity. We're thrilled to have Dr. Jackson with us to discuss the intersection of culture, equity, and veterinary medicine. Also with us is the phenomenal James Rodgers, the visionary leader behind Increased Access, an Indigenous-led organization dedicated to improving veterinary care access in Indigenous communities. James is deeply committed to policy advocacy and community-driven solutions that prioritize cultural respect and sustainability, and has been instrumental in bridging the gap between marginalized communities and the veterinary industry. Dr. Jackson, James, welcome to the show. Typically, before we jump into all of the meat and potatoes on the show, I have an icebreaker question. Let's imagine for a second if your favorite pet could talk. What do you think they'd say about the work that you're doing right now? How about we ask Dr. Jackson first?
My pet is a golden retriever. His name's Cider, and he means well. He has a lot of love. I don't think there's a lot of brain cells up in there, but I think he'd be very excited and would just squeal.
I love it. What about you, James?
I think Roscoe, who's was a bit of a bitey dog, and loves his outdoor adventures, would say, "Hurry up and finish. It's time to go for an adventure walk."
Hurry up and finish. You're always working. You have to tell him the work never ends, right? It never ends. Okay, you guys, thank you so much for answering that question. Let's get into it. You guys are both working at an amazing organization, Increased Access, and doing a bunch of amazing work, right? Before we jump into it, though, I do want to kind of set the stage for the listeners. Over the last few years, we've seen a powerful rise in the visibility of Indigenous stories, Indigenous voices, experiences. I think both inspiring and long overdue. However, there may be some people in the audience listening that may not fully understand the broader context of the reasons behind this resurgence. So before we dive into the veterinary care and animal welfare within Indigenous communities, Dr. Jackson, maybe this is you or James, I think it's important to set the stage. Could you help us kind of understand the landscape of what's going on in Indigenous communities right now? You guys are both in Canada. So what does that look like geographically, culturally, maybe even in terms of day-to-day life?
Sure. So I can speak up to that a bit. So in Canada, I guess in Canada and the U.S., I'm not too sure about kind of U.S. Indigenous history, but in Canadian, there's a long legacy of residential schools and colonization. So it's information that isn't necessarily taught or hasn't been taught in primary schools and secondary schools, which is pretty crazy considering it happened across the country. But pretty much the thought was to displace Indigenous children from their homes, from their communities, and then break the Indian was the term that they used to colonize the children into white culture.
James, do you have anything to add to that?
I think one of the resulting sort of issues is that many Indigenous communities have been underserved with essential services for over a century. And I think that's finally coming to light, and there's some reconciliation needed, a lot of reconciliation needed to address that.
Yeah, and so, that paints a picture beautifully, which is horrific. to hear the stories, to know what's going on. But I do think that it's very powerful, like I said, this resurgence, right? Where there is a lot more attention and acknowledgement of the wrong that's been caused to the communities and more support around what is needed. So let's jump into increased access then. James, share with me more about increased access, the organization's goals, how it particularly supports Indigenous communities with veterinary services.
Yeah, well, I think our number one goal would be community safety, and that's for all residents, whether they have two legs or four. Second to that would be to the current status quo for related to animal services and animal related community safety services is that volunteerism and philanthropy are kind of what we rely on to get things like vet care into remote and rural communities. And that just needs to change. I mean, I can't believe that we're at the beginning of that conversation. The idea that keeping people safe has been left up to, sort of hit and miss volunteerism and one and done kind of philanthropy for decades and decades and decades just needs to change.
What do you mean by keeping people safe?
Well, currently in Canada, the number one person to be bitten by a dog, if memory serves, we have a lot of federal statistics, but I think it's a 5 to 9 year old child in an Indigenous community. I could be getting this wrong, but I think it's between 7 and 9 p.m. on a Saturday in the summer, and that child is likely going to be bitten by a dog that's not theirs, and nor are they interacting with that dog. And so we know a lot about how unsafe communities are when there aren't adequate services like vet care. We also know a lot about how we can address that. And that's a big part of what increased access is working towards, is increasing the access to those services while also working on the sort of policy advocacy side, where we need to look at how to source ongoing, predictable funding, again, to get beyond the volunteerism and philanthropy that these services have been dependent on for too long.
Yeah. And that seems like a huge task. I'm not going to lie. It's huge, right? And so this is what your
Yes.
pup was saying is like, I'm ready to go on a walk. The work is never going to be done. What do you envision the next 5 years looking like? Who do you go to? How do you get those resources? How do you get that sustainability?
Well, on the first hand, I think it's for increased access, our membership is only Indigenous nations, and so I think so that's sort of step one for us, is building up a membership with similar interests and wants, like increased community safety, and then in the interim, working on direct services to meet those needs and wants. Like increased access to vet services, while at the same time working on that big picture of essentially working with all levels of government, so federal, provincial, territorial, even sort of regional and municipal, again, finding ways to establish ongoing, predictable funding and access to services. And those services not only include vet services, but animal bylaw enforcement and other essential services. And so we need to really let these different levels of government know what's going on,
Yeah.
and
Hold them to it
work
too,
with them to find
right?
solutions.
No empty promises. There's definitely money, and it needs to be allocated. Thank you so much, James. Dr. Jackson, from your perspective as an Indigenous veterinarian, how have you seen the lack of government support affect the well being of animals and the communities in these areas?
So it's a hard question to answer. So I guess the main way that these communities get access to veterinary care is like actual remote. We go out, we provide a services like a mass spay neuter program for usually like 4, 5, 7 days at a time, depending on like volunteer capability and everything like that. It's easier, I would say, from my experience, to do it in Alberta than it has been in BC. In Alberta, I found like we're able to drive to these places, but out in BC, we're not able to drive. Like we had to take a boat out to the community that I was in, and right there in itself, that makes it very, very challenging to move somewhere that you can do a spay in. I think it's just so hard because Canada's landscape is so different. Each community has very, very different needs, and there isn't like a one size fits all, because there's also like the Alberta Indigenous communities have completely different cultural backgrounds compared to the British Columbian communities. And so it's really hard to know like even me being an Indigenous person going into a different community, it's hard for me to know what that community would want, right? So I think we have to be mindful of always asking these communities what they want, what their goals are. And I think that's a way of like preventing neocolonialism, right? Is to ask them what they want and if they want our help and meet them where they're at that way, which is hard.
Yeah, it's hard but it's doable. We all know that it takes time, right? And it's interesting that you said that, like, as an Indigenous person,
Yeah.
you still have to operate with a level of cultural competency, not assuming that you know everything about every Indigenous community. And it's funny because sometimes when people ask me to speak at a
Hmm.
school or speak, at a conference, they ask me to speak on diversity issues. And before I really got heavy into this work, I was asking why. Why are you asking me? And I think it was so many conversations that I've had was because I'm a Black woman and I should know
Yeah.
about diversity issues. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah, I don't know everything about all of the vast cultures, the landscapes, and not even within my own ethnic group, right? There's still a level of cultural competence that I have to be aware of. Both
Yeah.
of you mentioned the importance of trust and
Yeah.
cultural competence, right? I have my strategies, but
Yeah.
how do you approach building trust in Indigenous communities? I'm going to give this to you, Dr. Emma, because you're going out there. How do you build trust?
I think the easiest way to build trust is just to talk to people and just talk to them like they're human and then find common ground, right? Like ask them about their pet, ask them how their pet got their name. And I think like when you begin to like build those relationships, people start to open up a little bit and then it just comes with time.
As a veterinarian myself, I can walk into an exam room with African American or Black clients, and it's almost like a sigh of relief that comes over them because immediately they think that we've broken a cultural,
Mm.
barrier with, there's this trust that I didn't even really earn. I just got it because I'm a Black person. And so I was just wondering whether you identify yourself when you go to these communities as Indigenous and whether that helps you make a connection.
I do sometimes. I don't all the time. Like I would say half the time people can tell right away, depending on which reserve we're at or which community we're at. But if we're on like an outside community, they can't really tell. I would say I don't start with it and I just talk to people and then about their lives and then slowly it trickles out. And then right away, it's just like an instant connection is deeply formed. And I feel like that's how my approach has been to making connection. And I feel like that's been well received.
I 100% agree with that. Having conversation, adapting communication styles, right? Based on who you're working with or who you're talking to.
Hmm.
For me, it's recognizing body language, recognizing tone, recognizing the words that I'm using, right? That could
Yeah.
carry different meanings across different cultures. James, what about you? Are you actually, I know you do a lot of work. Are you actually, what I will say, in the field? Like, are you actually going out and working with these communities?
Yeah, I do go into the communities. Often I'm the first point of contact with increased access, and I'm not Indigenous. And so we do address that right off the hop typically. And, make the point that, again, our board is largely Indigenous, but more importantly, our membership is Indigenous. And really that first contact when we're starting to discuss if a nation wants to work with us is them sharing what their needs and wants are and for us to share what the services are that we can provide. And one of the critical ones there is animal related community safety planning. So coming up with what that, and again, that's based on if that's what the community chooses to do. Often our first connection is with somebody in the administration. And what we found is that the community's administration and then the elected leadership and the hereditary leadership and the citizens might all have different ideas of what the priorities are. So again, it's about a starting place, like I said, usually with the administration, and then working with them to dig a little deeper, understand the animal dynamics in the community, and again, what the rest of the community's wants and needs are and where they see challenges, and then helping to facilitate community processes so they own their planning and direct it. And then we're here to help make connections. One community we're working with right now is very interested in developing an animal related bylaw. And so worked with other communities with really progressive, robust animal bylaws. So we're just, connecting the two, saying, hey, this might be a template, so you don't have to start from scratch, reinvent any wheels. So again, a facilitation role to a large part. And then aside from that, the policy advocacy side, things like delivering a 150-year overdue invoice to the federal government for services not provided.
Yeah, services not provided. Work still needs to be done. I appreciate you, James, for the call out, one, as a non-Indigenous facilitator of an Indigenous-led organization, right? And how you, and what you just said, you're ensuring that Indigenous voices and leadership are at the forefront of the work. And I think that is so important. And I think other organizations that may be looking to learn from your model, I've never heard of a membership model before. Can you tell us a little bit of what that looks like? How does one become a member? What does that membership mean?
Membership for any nation is free. Again, as if either a member of the community, a citizen, or somebody in the administration or in the leadership gets in touch with us, and they can do that through our increasedaccess.org website. We then sort of outline, again, the different services that we provide and the policy sort of advocacy work we do, and really custom design what they want from us. So again, it's not a template, as Dr. Jackson pointed out. This isn't a one size fits all, and every community has different challenges. There's similarities between some communities, but each one's unique, and so we need to keep the structure. I would refer to dynamic steering. We sort of just figure out what the first step is for a community, and then we'll figure out next steps as we go together. And again, as Dr. Jackson pointed out, there's a lot of conversations, and it starts usually one-on-one, and then hopefully we can get into community-wide conversations to get a better sense of, again, what everybody needs and wants.
You mentioned 150-year kind of tally, right, regarding animal services, animal care on reservations. Tell us more about the specific legislative changes that you're advocating for, or one that you are, that you're in the thick of right now.
Yeah, and I guess I rounded it up to 150 years, but, referencing the 1876, so almost 149 years now, the 1876 Indian Act. And in that act, and again, Dr. Jackson referred to this, a lot of the what's happened since then in terms of with Indigenous communities and peoples. In that original act, the role of pound keeper was deferred to nations, and so the keeping of dogs. And so, again, going back 149 years, that role was deferred, but without any subsequent support, whether that be infrastructure, which is a critical piece. Again, you think about where can vet care happen in a community, or where can animals be temporarily held for community safety, like a shelter facility. And again, also related to the services not provided. That's one level, again, at federal level. Provincially, we found that often the government is taking direction for policy design and resource allocation from provincial SPCAs, for instance. And so in that case, and not from the communities that are impacted by those policies and distribution decisions. And so for us to have more Indigenous voices and representation at those decision-making tables, whether that's provincially or federally, we think is key and is in keeping with the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you for sharing that. I was in Colombia recently working with an organization. We had to spay, there were over 300 dogs we had to spay, cats and dogs that we had to spay over the weekend. And there's only one veterinary clinic in this town. And we ended up going to a school and spaying and neutering 300 cats and dogs in a classroom where you're coming to, Canada, the US, and there's fancy vet clinics and fancy surgical areas, right? It's quite different. So it's like, where are we going to actually do this work? So I can only imagine, Dr. Jackson, you work directly in these communities. So share some of the challenges that you faced, maybe in practice, maybe in poverty, maybe in land ownership. How have they impacted access to veterinary care?
I guess it's all pretty connected with how it's been impacted. So with like the going to communities and performing the spay neuter programs, they're often in big community centers, probably similar to what you've experienced. or old like hockey arenas. So you basically set up all the tables and it's kind of just an assembly line. Everybody moves through. It's big, it's scary, it's overwhelming, it's loud, animals get loose. Like it's like a very crazy experience to go through. But somehow it works. Somehow all of those cats and dogs, they get their spay neuter, they get vaccines, they get flea tick treatments, and they go home. It's amazing like how much work you can do and do well when you want to, and like even with like not very typical resources, you can still get the job done. I think it's a mindset to move away kind of from the ivory tower of what clinics can look like and what they can actually do and actually have good outcomes on these communities when they need to. Land ownership is tricky because it comes along with dog ownership, and dog ownership on reserves is very, very different compared to what it may look like in traditional communities. So dog ownership, we typically consider most animals on reserve have a home. They may not look like they do, but they do. They have some type of guardian who takes care of them. But these animals or these dogs typically aren't on leashes. They don't have a collar, they don't have a microchip, and they're free roaming. And they can free roam throughout their entire community. And it can look to someone who's not used to that experience that this is a stray dog. Like, what's going to happen? They're going to get run over. They're starving. They're covered in fleas. And these are some of the fattest dogs I have ever seen. They are well loved. Like, they have a home. And so that can make it very, very complicated to navigate, especially being like going on to the communities and being invited in and to provide help. So everything just looks a little bit different than what we're used to. So it can really push you outside of your comfort bubble, that's for sure.
It's a beautiful thing for us to get outside of our own heads, outside of the way we think that things should be going on. And no fault of our own, right? Society's told us that this is what it needs to be, or vet schools told us that this is how we need to operate in these facilities. But I was also having a conversation with someone recently about in their community, they don't even want the dogs to be called stray dogs. They'd rather the dogs be called community dogs, right? Because then if you're saying stray, it implies that there's no caretaker.
Yeah.
And speaking specifically in this community, because I was just in Colombia, y'all, but people were bringing dogs that were theirs, right? But that the dogs like come in at night, but for the rest of the day, they're kind of doing their own thing. They're hanging out with their partners and, going to the bars literally and hanging out there, right? And then sometimes we have this kind of saviorism complex where we come in and we say, we're going to take this dog from this community because we have a better home for the dog somewhere else. When that dog is really tied to a family, tied to maybe several families, tied to a community. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything on that.
Yeah, I do. I guess that's a really hot topic around Calgary, because where I live, Calgary is a big urban center surrounded by many reserves outside of it. And white people love to go to these reserves and take the dogs and put them into rescues and then rehome them. So in my urban clinics in Calgary, I can tell right away when someone says like, oh, I just adopted this dog. They're a res dog. And I look at the dog and I'm like, with its new family. And I'm like, this dog had a family. Like, this dog is fat. It's comfortable. It's happy. It likes me. It's like happy to see me. And so it's a really hard thing to navigate with this new family who's so happy that they just got this new dog from the animal shelter. We saved it, right? And I don't usually say anything, right? I just say like, oh, they're very nice, because I don't know what good it would be to shame this new family who just got this new dog that I think their dog's stolen and I think their dog had a family, right? So I don't know. It's an interesting thing to navigate, and I don't know what the right answer is.
Yeah, I don't think I have the right answer either, to be honest, right? I think we can talk about
Yeah.
this for some time because I think the intent is to provide a better opportunity for these animals, but it's not always the case. And there's potentially a family that's missing that dog right now.
If I could just add one point, which I think we're looking at animal guardianship as sort of, we're pet parents. right? And that these dogs and cats are children, which is
I love
lovely. It
that word,
seems like
lovely.
a greater level of, of care. And, with that comes, there's sort of a standard there of, so being a good parent, a good pet parent means you're providing vet care whenever it's needed and all this sort of highest standard of, food and whatever it is. That standard is typically developed or established in urban dominant culture areas. And so if you don't have access, either because of where you live, like geographically don't have access, or you don't have financial access to things like vet care, you become a bad pet parent. Right. So then we start
Yeah.
now judging people because of what they don't have access to, not for what they want. And so it creates this dynamic where, again, savior complex, well, I have to go in and save this dog from this terrible family that's not providing
Dig
vet
a little
care. Well,
deeper.
dig a little deeper. And for me,
Yeah.
that's a segue to one of my personal motivations related to vet care is that we need to start seeing more nonprofit vet clinics. We need to start seeding the nonprofit vet sector. The fact that we've been depending on for-profit clinics, a for-profit sector, veterinary care, which is largely for-profit, for all these years for all the community's needs, it's a for-profit sector. It wasn't
Yeah.
designed for nonprofit services, right? And they're largely based in urban centers or high population centers where there's a clientele that can pay for their services, and they're not cheap and they're getting more expensive. And so I think a nonprofit vet sector needs to be seeded. I think the staff need to be fully paid market rates, no volunteerism, no discounts because it's a nonprofit. And I think in Canada, a large part of that needs to be mobile. I mean, if you look at the distribution of communities that have been underserved forever, it's a rural, remote distribution. And so we need to see more mobile nonprofit vet clinics. And the governments can do a lot to help that, such as student loan forgiveness for vets and techs that decide to go into nonprofit rural and remote service for, say, 2 years. But again, I could rant for a while on that one.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm holding the mic here. I was just going to say it louder for the people in the back. Like, forgive the student loans, pay the people. They are still very much worth their education and their time, right? And I think that most people don't go into nonprofit sector for the fear of not being able to pay their bills, not being able to pay their student loans back, which veterinary care comes with a huge debt. It blows my mind
And high
because
stress.
of how many veterinarians are getting paid. And this is not to knock the veterinary profession at all, because I love the profession deeply, but many are getting paid off of production, right? So the more I see, the more I get paid. It's this driven, the root of evil of money, right? Being pushed kind of on you, and you can't even really practice.
Well, in Canada, a country with socialized healthcare for humans, seems like a great place to
Yeah.
really kick off the socialized healthcare for animals. And again, that's intrinsically linked to community safety. If we want our communities and our citizens across this nation to be across this country to be feel safe walking around their communities, we need to be providing increased access to these essential services. And COVID put the exclamation point on the fact that these are essential services.
Yeah.
And again, that's, vet care, animal bylaw or regulation enforcement services. These are all things that keep communities safe. And there's the bitey dog issue, which is, the one that I think a lot of community administrations hear about the most. I mean, there's getting into garbage and bitey and jumpy dogs, under socialized dogs. But the other maybe people don't know about as much is when cat populations get out of control, get too big, they often become sick, upper respiratory issues, all that kind of stuff. And then they become attractants to wild predators. And so now you've got, in where I live, cougars, bears coming into human populated areas because these cats and, dogs too, again, if dogs get parvo, the puppies, you have these wild animals coming in to get these attractants. And so you have a increase in human wild animal conflict situations. So the layers of compromised safety as related to animals is varied for sure.
I think it ties into One Health. I think it ties into public health, what you're just saying there. Dr. Jackson, you're a star. Okay, I'm gonna have to get your autograph. You are a star. Wild Rose Vets. Congratulations on that docuseries. Tell us a little bit more about
Thanks.
the docuseries. Anything that you can share with us about it? I am interested about representation in veterinary medicine and what that means to you, especially as it relates to the series.
So yeah, in regards to Wild Rose Vets, it was not something I thought I was going to be doing. Like I when I filmed it, it was a year ago, so I'd only been out of vet school for 2 years, and I said no initially to being like they asked me to do it, and I thought no, I have no business filming a TV show. Like I just graduated, like I'm just trying my best to survive right now, right in this new field and new skills and everything like that. And then they were persistent, and I thought about it a lot after my initial no, just because I was working for a corporate company at that point in time. And so they wanted to film it at my corporate company. And then it was just had so many layers of what I did not want to get involved in. But then they found an alternative of being able to film it at an animal rescue facility in Calgary. And so I thought, why not? Like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, if something goes wrong, they can just film it out. They don't have to put something in it. And I think what they told me when they were talking about recruiting me, and they said, Emma, all we want to do is like showcase Indigenous success. We just want to showcase Indigenous excellence, and that's all it's going to be. And so I thought, okay, maybe. And we ended up started filming, and it was at ARCS, and it ended up being a really good experience because they got to show me up there. I had a platform, I was on a stage, right? And I could just showcase that Indigenous kids can do this too, right? And so the whole point of me doing this was to be completely out of my comfort zone, to be completely vulnerable, because what makes for good TV is when things go wrong. But I figured, like, I've been resilient my entire life. I'm Indigenous. Like, of course I can film a TV show 2 years out of vet school, right? I feel like that's what Indigenous resilience is. And I hate the term being called resilient because maybe I don't want to be resilient anymore, but I ended up doing it. And it has aired, and I've gotten lots of calls and lots of texts from kids and elders on the reserve, and they've seen me up there, and they look forward to it every Monday that they got to watch someone from their reserve on the TV show.
Oh
and I
my
feel
gosh,
like
I
that made it all
100%
worth
feel
it.
you. Just that term that you just mentioned, resilience, and how you're like, I've been resilient my whole life, right? Now I just want to practice. But you're an advocate, you're a role model,
Yeah.
you're representation that matters in the field. And I feel you. I feel like the stigma, resilience goes with Indigenous, strong goes with Black women, right? Like there's certain terms, and it's like, I don't want to be strong anymore. I just want to be, as they say now, in my soft girl era, right? But
Yeah.
I think that I commend you for that, for being who you are and what you represent and the work that you're doing and the light that you're shining on so many young people. So looking ahead for both of you, what are the most critical changes needed? Maybe we should just pick one thing, one single thing, both from a policy and a community engagement perspective to improve veterinary services for Indigenous populations. What is that one most critical change that you think is needed?
Water access on reserves, clean drinking water.
James, what about you?
I mean, incredible that it's that basic and fundamental.
And I want to understand too, what is happening with the water? Why is there no clean water?
That's a good question. There just was never a facility in place to put it there.
Wow. So are there changes being made to support that? Are there projects? Are there things that are going on? Is it look hopeful for the future?
I think no. I don't know if these communities will ever get clean drinking water, to be honest. I think the most hope we ever had was when Trudeau was first elected into government in Canada, because I remember I was pretty young, like I was still over age, like, but like being in Alberta, it's a very conservative province, and so I thought, oh, maybe Trudeau, maybe I can think about it. But he really made efforts to reach out to Indigenous communities. He did, and we go, just like the continued mistrust of the government because nothing came from it. Like Trudeau's biggest thing when he got elected for the first time was to have access to clean drinking water on reservations. And I remember being on the reserve, and they would send out buses to the reserve to bring Native people to the election facilities to vote. The Liberal government funded that. And then there was no clean drinking water at the end. And so I don't think there will ever be clean drinking water, because I think that's as close to we got as it actually happening that never did.
I'm such an optimistic person. I know that there's realities of the world that we cannot change, but I'm hoping that it does change for the sake of the people who need clean drinking water. There was a an article that I read probably a couple years ago now. Maybe it's a 2-year-old article, but it was talking about euthanasia. And this was not specifically for an Indigenous community, but it just reminded me of what you were saying, how some people have to take their dogs home for burial after being euthanized by the veterinarian, because there are a lot of veterinary organizations that say, hey, if you have to euthanize your pet and you can't afford to, we will euthanize your pet for you. However, you must take the pet with you and dispose of your animal. However, like, we don't know, we don't care to know. We'll do this for you. We won't charge you for the euthanasia. But that euthazol actually stays in the body of the animal. And the article was talking about once that body goes into the soil, right? How that drug lasts and kind of gets pulled into these water streams that are now harming communities, which I thought was wild. But yeah, I'm hopeful.
If I could add to that, a shallow grave, because digging a 6-foot hole is a lot of work. A shallow grave often leaves those animals that are essentially contaminated with euthanol available to predators, wild animals. And so again, and I have to say, if you can find a vet clinic willing to even do the euthanasia for free, my goodness, give me their number. I mean, holy.
I will refuse to work anywhere that won't at minimum do that. It's a part of our ethics if we have to, if the owners want to. Okay, we have talked about so much. You guys have been incredibly amazing guests and so resourceful. I am so honored to actually be on this call with you guys, knowing the work that you guys are both doing. For our listeners, how can they get involved or support efforts to provide better veterinary care and services in Indigenous communities?
My first suggestion would be get in touch with us. Increasedaccess.org is the website. All our contact info is there. And, whether that's somebody from a community looking for increasing their access to different services, animal-related services, community safety-related stuff, vets, techs wanting to volunteer, we can direct you to nonprofit organizations, MASH-style clinic operations, all sorts of things. So I'd say that's a good starting place. And also, it's a little cliche, but write a letter to your provincial or federal representative and let them know that enough's enough. We can't keep relying on volunteerism and philanthropy to provide for essential services and keep communities safe. We need to do better as a society.
Dr. Jackson, what about you?
I think just what they're doing right now, listening to this podcast, asking questions, not keeping your head in the ground, just being aware that these problems exist is like one step forward than where we were yesterday.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you guys both for that. And I will make sure that in the show notes that all of that information where people can find you is there. And before we close, I always end with a final question. If there was one thing that you wanted the audience to know before you leave today, what would it be?
What would I want to leave the audience with? I think just recognizing the importance and the power that one person can make if you ask one question.
I think, the challenges are big, but there are solutions. And what we're lacking right now is, I think, a lot of political will. And so, again, each of us can impact that as individuals and even more so together.
Thank you for joining us on Critters and Cultures, everyone, where we explore the deep connections between humans, animals, and the world around us. Remember, every person has a story, every creature has a story, and every culture has its wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep discovering the wonders of our shared world.